In the winter of 1933, as Adolf Hitler assumed the chancellery, Germany remained a nation in chains. The iron weight of the Treaty of Versailles, forged in the aftermath of 1918, had systematically dismantled its military might. The army, the Reichswehr, was a shadow of its former self, a force capped at a mere 100,000 men. It was an army forbidden from possessing the tools of modern warfare. No tanks, no heavy artillery, no combat aircraft. On the seas, its navy was reduced to a coastal patrol of small ships. Even the nation's military mind, its famed general staff, was outlawed, forced into the shadows, its planning structures camouflaged within organizations bearing innocuous names. Arms production was choked by the unblinking gaze of international surveillance. Yet, beneath this veneer of compliance, a deep and bitter resentment simmered. Within the military leadership and the fervent nationalist circles, the will to defy these limitations, to secretly rebuild Germany's war potential, had never been extinguished. The arrival of the National Socialist regime did not create this desire, it unleashed it. What changed was the speed, the sheer scale, and the absolute political determination to turn clandestine dreams into terrifying reality. In the first months of his rule, Hitler's propaganda machine declared the dawn of a new era. The German people, they were told, had finally regained strong leadership, a force that would shatter the shackles of humiliation imposed by the victors of the Great War. Publicly, Germany feigned adherence to the treaty, but behind the curtain, a secret rearmament had begun, cloaked in the language of administrative reform and public works. The initial steps were cautious, designed to avoid provoking the Western powers, while the foundations for a massive military expansion were laid. This clandestine effort was not entirely new. Since the days of the Weimar Republic, secret links with the Soviet Union had allowed German engineers to test forbidden weapons on Russian soil, far from the eyes of inspectors. But under Hitler, these isolated practices were forged into a coherent national strategy, inextricably linking economic reconstruction with the preparation for war. The creation of jobs in arms factories and massive infrastructure projects was sold to the world as a social triumph. In truth, it was the assembly of an industrial engine, primed and ready to fuel a colossal military machine. Then, in 1935, the mask was cast aside. Hitler stood before the world and openly announced the return of compulsory military service. In that single act, the limited Reichswehr was reborn as the Wehrmacht. Divisions swelled, and the first armored and motorized units began to take shape. That same year, the Luftwaffe, long nurtured in secret, was officially unveiled, and vast resources were poured into creating the most modern air force on the planet. Even the Kriegsmarine, the Navy, began its own dark renaissance, with new submarines sliding from the slipways and plans for a fleet that could once again challenge the masters of the sea. The quiet defiance had become a roar. The secret preparations had broken cover, transforming a nation's smoldering resentment into the polished, gleaming steel of a war machine poised for conquest. The world had been put on notice, not by a declaration of war, but by the deafening sound of 1,000,000 marching feet on soil where they were forbidden to tread. From the ashes of defeat, a new German army, the Heer, began its inexorable rise. The strictures of Versailles had limited its ranks to a mere 100,000 men, a force designed for internal policing, not conquest. But within a few short years, that shadow of an army would swell into a host of millions. New formations were born: infantry, panzer, and motorized divisions, granting this reborn force a flexibility and mobility unthinkable in the previous war. Officer schools, once shuttered, reactivated their programs, instilling a new doctrine forged in the fires of memory. It was a violent rejection of the positional warfare, the static slaughter, that had consumed a generation from 1914 to 1918. In its place, the vision of a quick, decisive war was relentlessly promoted, a conflict where armored vehicles and aircraft would serve as the tip of the spear. Soaring above it all was the Luftwaffe, the personal project of Hermann Göring, and the most visible symbol of Germany's new military power. From its inception, its focus was ruthlessly to seize the medium bombers, such as the Heinkel 111, were designed not merely to match foreign capabilities, but to perfect a new style of war. The Luftwaffe was not born as an independent strategic weapon. It was conceived as flying artillery, an integral part of a ground-pounding offensive, designed to strike enemy concentrations and shatter their will to resist. At sea, the Kriegsmarine faced a far greater challenge. Germany could not hope to compete with the sheer number of ships in Britain's Royal Navy. It opted instead for a strategy of asymmetry, centered on the lurking threat of the U-boat. In 1935, a naval agreement with Great Britain was signed, in theory setting limits, but in practice providing justification for a dramatic expansion of naval construction. The most audacious vision, known as Plan Z, called for a fleet of massive battleships and aircraft carriers. But by the outbreak of war, it remained largely a dream on paper. The U-boat, however, was a present danger, a potent weapon capable of severing the lifelines of an empire. This entire military rebirth was guided by a doctrinal framework obsessed with avoiding the mistakes of the past. The trauma of the trenches had convinced German military thinkers that the next conflict must be resolved with shocking speed, through the coordinated use of every available weapon. Thus, the idea of Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, took hold. It was not a single codified plan, but a set of fluid principles that prized surprise, velocity, and violent, focused power. The Army's armored columns would rupture enemy lines. The Air Force would annihilate key targets and disrupt the rear guard. And only then would the infantry move in, not to fight for ground, but to consolidate a victory already achieved. A new theory of warfare had been meticulously engineered, a terrifyingly efficient fusion of man, machine, and doctrine, designed for a single purpose. All that remained was for the theory to be put to its terrible and final test. It was a new theory of violence, engineered to inflict not just defeat, but psychological collapse. The objective was to destabilize the enemy from the first moment, to strike with such speed and ferocity that there would be no time to regroup, no chance to form a coherent defense. This was a radical break from the grim attrition of the past. Instead of slowly bleeding an adversary dry through the sheer mass of force, this new doctrine aimed for a swift, surgical severing of its capacity to resist. Its execution demanded a symphony of destruction, a level of meticulous planning, logistical efficiency, and battlefield coordination previously unimagined. Even as the Wehrmacht was still taking shape in the second half of the 1930s, lacking many essential resources, this doctrine became the bedrock of its training, shaping a new generation of officers and soldiers. Publicly, the architect of this rising power spoke of peace, of a just revision to an unfair international order. But in private, every sinew of the state was being strained toward a single purpose: rearmament. A secret financial alchemy was at work. Through a phantom corporation issuing notes known as Mefo bills, the regime funneled billions into arms production, a shadow budget that concealed the terrifying pace of its military expansion from the world. This financial engineering staved off immediate economic collapse, allowing a nation to rearm in the shadows. The very economy was remade in the image of war. Heavy industry, steel production, and research into synthetic fuels were wrested into the grip of state control. Agriculture was reoriented toward a single goal: self-sufficiency, ensuring the nation could feed itself when the fighting began. The four-year plan, launched in 1936, was the policy's clearest expression: a national mandate to prepare Germany for war, to sever its dependence on foreign imports, and to build the capacity to sustain a long and brutal conflict. Within the German military command, there were whispers of caution. Generals who had witnessed the slaughter of the First World War understood the profound risks of a premature confrontation. But the regime's absolute authority, coupled with a string of early foreign policy triumphs, steadily eroded their reluctance. Confidence grew that Germany could, once again, challenge the continent. The army, which had kept a low profile during the Weimar years, was elevated, becoming the central pillar of a state that now saw itself as a militarized national community. Beyond the borders, these preparations stirred a deep unease. Yet a continent haunted by the ghosts of the Great War chose to look away. A policy of appeasement, born from a desperate desire to avoid another cataclysm, allowed the war machine to grow, unopposed. And so, by 1939, the work was done. The Wehrmacht had become a force of several million men, armed with modern weaponry and indoctrinated in a revolutionary creed of warfare. The gears of the state had been re-engineered for a singular, terrible purpose, forging an instrument of conquest, while the world convinced itself that peace was still possible. What had begun as rearmament disguised as a social program had been forged into a war machine of terrible efficiency. A nation reborn in steel, with vast armored divisions, a formidable air force, and an expanding navy. By the spring of 1939, the question within the German High Command was no longer if Poland would be attacked, but simply when. In April, the Führer issued his directive for swift, decisive action. The objective transcended mere military conquest. It was the imposition of a definitive solution to what the regime called the Polish problem, a matter of both territory and ideology. The guidelines were brutally clear. Eliminate Poland's defensive capacity from the first day, shatter its administrative structures, and leave no doubt that this was not a temporary campaign. To achieve this, meticulous organization was paramount. By mid-year, the plans were finalized for the fastest, most violent campaign Europe had yet conceived. An overwhelming force was concentrated at strategic points along the border. 1.5 million men, nearly 2,500 tanks, more than 2,000 aircraft, all poised for the offensive. The full might of the Heer, the Luftwaffe, and the Kriegsmarine was mobilized, though the Navy's role would be limited in the land-based conflict to come. Tactical preparations hinged on a terrifying new synergy between ground and air. It was a concept yet to be formally named, but its principles were lethally clear. Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Panzer divisions, screened by tactical aviation, would not engage in a war of attrition. They would pierce deep into the country's interior, bypassing defensive lines, sowing chaos and confusion in the enemy rearguard. But steel and fire alone were not enough. The Reich required a grand deception. For weeks, a vast propaganda apparatus worked to justify the coming slaughter, crafting messages that portrayed Poland as an aggressor. Minor border incidents were magnified to cultivate an atmosphere of imminent threat. The final fabrication was the most infamous, the Gleiwitz incident, a covert operation carried out by German forces disguised as Poles, simulating an attack on a German radio station. To the world, it was presented as an unprovoked act of Polish aggression, the immediate pretext for war. At 4:45 in the morning, on the 1st of September 1939, the attack began. The Luftwaffe's bombs were the first to fall. In that moment, the fragile peace of a generation was shattered, and the world was plunged into a darkness from which it would not emerge for 6 long years. A new and brutal chapter of human history had begun, written not in ink, but in blood. In the pre-dawn darkness, the assault began not with a single shot, but with a symphony of destruction. Across the Polish interior, strategic nerves were severed. Airfields, communication hubs, and military depots erupted in flame. Almost in the same breath, a tide of steel surged across the frontier, a multi-pronged invasion designed to disorient and shatter the enemy from the very first moments. Spearheading the assault were the Panzer divisions, a new calculus of warfare moving at terrifying speed. Flanked by motorized infantry, they did not conquer territory so much as consume it. The effect was cataclysmic. Within mere days, the foundations of Polish defense began to crumble. This was a war of relentless momentum. Pockets of fierce resistance were not engaged in protracted battle. They were simply bypassed, encircled, and left for the rear guard to extinguish. This fluid strategy allowed the advance to remain unbroken. Polish units, fighting with desperate courage, found themselves isolated, unable to form a coherent line against an enemy that was everywhere at once. Above them, the omnipresent shadow of the Luftwaffe smothered any attempt to regroup, any hope of a coordinated counterstroke. While Poland burned, a different war was being waged within the Reich, a war for the mind. The state's propaganda machine spun a narrative of a just and necessary operation, a preemptive strike against Polish aggression. Alleged atrocities against German minorities were amplified into a cause for war. The Reich was cast not as the aggressor, but as the victim, forced to defend its honor. In his fevered speeches, Hitler repeated the lie until it acquired the veneer of truth. All diplomatic paths had been exhausted. This was an inevitable response to provocation. Newsreels, meticulously curated, projected a sanitized reality onto cinema screens, showing smiling soldiers and armored columns advancing unopposed. On the battlefield, the German military machine operated with a brutal, real-time precision. Mobile divisions radioed their progress, calling upon the sky for support. The Luftwaffe would answer, its dive bombers acting as flying artillery, blasting obstacles from the path of the advance. This terrifying synergy of land and air power produced a velocity of conquest that stunned not only the Poles, but the world's military observers. Within a few days, German forces were deep inside enemy territory, encircling Warsaw and other key cities. Behind the military onslaught lay a foundation of cynical diplomacy. Hitler had secured his eastern flank, ensuring the Soviet Union would not intervene. The instrument of this assurance was a pact, signed in August, ostensibly a treaty of non-aggression. But hidden within its clauses was a secret protocol, a death warrant for Poland, dividing its territory between two totalitarian giants. With this dark bargain, Hitler had seemingly eliminated the specter of a two-front war. He gambled that France and Great Britain, as they had before, would once again choose appeasement over action. It was a fatal miscalculation. On the 3rd of September, the ultimatums expired. The voices of France and the United Kingdom, somber and resolute, crackled over the world's radios. They were now at war with Germany. The invasion of Poland was more than the first battle of a new war. It was the moment an ideology of violence was fully unleashed, when the fragile peace of a generation was irrevocably shattered. A border had been crossed, but so too had a threshold in human history, leading from a world of uneasy diplomacy into an abyss of total war. In the West, a strange and unnerving silence descended. Though great powers had made solemn commitments to Poland, their declarations of war were followed not by the thunder of guns, but by a war of whispers and shadows. For weeks, this phony war allowed Germany to pursue its brutal calculus on a single front, unburdened by reprisal. Within the Reich itself, the news was filtered through the vast machinery of the state. Propaganda had tilled the soil for months, presenting the invasion as a just and necessary act. To a nation still nursing the wounds of a past humiliation, it was sold as the only path to restoring its honor. The narrative was singular, absolute. Censorship silenced any dissenting voice, while the virtues of sacrifice, discipline, and national pride were elevated to a state religion. The true cost, the casualties and the horror, was carefully hidden from view. The campaign itself was a maelstrom of steel and fire, swift and absolute. On the 17th of September, the Soviet Union, honoring its secret pact with Germany, stormed across Poland's eastern frontier. The maneuver sealed the nation's fate, accelerating the disintegration of an army already in full retreat. Warsaw held on, a bastion of defiance, but finally capitulated under the weight of relentless bombardment. The Polish resistance was an act of profound courage, but courage alone could not stand against the overwhelming technical and organizational might of its aggressors. By September's end, the map of Europe had been violently redrawn. Poland was gone, carved in two by totalitarian giants. For the Nazi regime, the campaign was more than a victory. It was a proof of concept. It was a stunning demonstration of military effectiveness, of meticulous planning, and of total political control. The German High Command saw its theories of rapid, mechanized warfare validated with terrifying efficiency. The word Blitzkrieg had not yet entered the world's lexicon, but its devastating essence had been unleashed. The Polish campaign became the blueprint. Generals pored over every detail, refining the mechanisms for the conquests to come. In Berlin, parades filled the streets. Victory bulletins proclaimed the superiority of the German system, and the image of the German soldier was glorified into myth. This first, stunning success reinforced the intoxicating idea of an inevitable destiny, a Reich destined to expand, to overcome any obstacle with the same speed and ruthless determination. The invasion of Poland was not merely the start of a war. It was the successful test of a new grammar of destruction, one that would soon be spoken across the whole of the continent. The first chapter was written, a story of stunning success celebrated in the streets of a triumphant capital. But it was merely the prologue to a global tragedy, a chilling testament to how the promise of a swift victory can blind a nation to the long, dark road ahead. The year was 1940. It was not merely the continuation of a world war, but the dawn of a new philosophy of conflict, a terrifying symphony where speed, surprise, and propaganda were instruments as potent as any weapon. This was the age of the Blitzkrieg, the lightning war. After the swift subjugation of Poland, the German war machine turned its gaze westward. The objective? France and its allies. But this would be no repeat of the grinding attrition of the Great War. The German High Command envisioned a victory forged in motion, a masterpiece of coordination. The concept was devastatingly simple: deep, rapid, and synchronized penetrations by air and ground forces, designed to shatter the enemy's nerve and dislocate their command before a coherent response could ever be mounted. In May, the storm broke over the neutral nations of the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. They were not the primary target, but stepping stones in a grand strategy to outflank the pride of the French military. The Maginot Line, a monumental fortress of concrete and steel, built to bleed any German invasion dry, stood waiting. But the German armor never came. In a stroke of breathtaking audacity, the Wehrmacht simply went around it, pushing its panzer divisions through the dense, rolling hills of the Ardennes, a region the Allied command had dismissed as impassable for a modern army. This single tactical choice was the key that unlocked the entire campaign. Panzer spearheads tore through the thin defenses, opening gaping wounds in the Allied front, pushing the British and French forces north, and severing them from their own rear. The Netherlands could not withstand the onslaught. The German advance, preceded by waves of intense aerial bombardment, triggered a swift and total collapse of the Dutch army. The city of Rotterdam was immolated from the air, a brutal message of the consequences of resistance. The threat of absolute annihilation compelled surrender. Belgium, too, was overwhelmed. British, French, and Belgian forces desperately tried to form a cohesive defensive line, but they were engulfed by meticulously planned German maneuvers. The unprecedented mobility of the attackers meant that before a firm front could be established, it was already outflanked, surrounded. The decisive blow fell at Sedan. There, German forces stormed across the Meuse River, shattering the French defenses that were supposed to hold the line. Once across, the armored divisions did not pause. They pivoted, launching a relentless westward thrust, a sickle cut, driving for the English Channel itself. The sheer velocity of the movement paralyzed the Allied command. There was no time to regroup, no opportunity to form a new strategy. The enemy was everywhere at once. Command structures dissolved, morale evaporated. As the armored scythe reached the coast, the Allied armies in Belgium and northern France were completely encircled. Trapped, with their backs pressed against the cold waters of the Channel, only one sliver of coastline remained. A single port became the only possible point of escape: Dunkirk. In a matter of weeks, the established doctrines of warfare had been pulverized. The great static defenses, the very symbols of military security, were rendered impotent. A brutal lesson had been taught on the fields of France, that the most formidable fortress is not one of stone or steel, but of imagination, and that in the crucible of war, even the strongest walls can be undone by a single, terrifying new idea. The steel jaws of the trap were closing, yet, at the moment of absolute victory, they paused. A decision from the High Command, still debated in the annals of history, brought the German advance to a halt. In that brief, inexplicable hesitation, hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers slipped away by sea. But this tactical reprieve could not alter the campaign's brutal trajectory. France was a nation fractured, its forces overwhelmed, its government dissolving under the sheer velocity of the German onslaught. Paris, the city of light, was occupied without a prolonged struggle. By June, the nation had requested an armistice. The military victory was total, achieved with a swiftness that shattered the memory of the First World War's grinding attrition. This was not merely an operational success, it was a triumph of perception. In Germany, the regime seized upon the victory, forging an image of an invincible new army, a testament to the superiority of the National Socialist system. Images of the victory parade through Paris, of triumphant advances, were broadcast across the Reich, flickering in newsreels and crackling over the radio. Hitler was cast as the brilliant strategist who had humbled the old powers. His generals were celebrated as national heroes. This carefully crafted narrative bound the country together. For a population still bearing the scars of defeat in the Great War, still smarting from the humiliations of the Treaty of Versailles, this was a moment of historic revenge. Morale soared to unprecedented heights. Confidence in the political and military leadership became absolute. The idea took root that the Reich could dominate Europe through an unstoppable combination of strength, speed, and sheer will. On a military level, the campaign was a complete validation of the German doctrine. Armored units, operating in concert with the Luftwaffe and sustained by ruthlessly efficient logistics, proved that modern war could be decided in weeks, not years. The Air Force was pivotal, crippling enemy defenses and clearing the path for the ground assault. German commanders watched with satisfaction as their theories were executed with lethal precision. Unified command, tactical surprise, and relentless mobility had been the decisive factors. The enemy, trapped in rigid defensive strategies and hobbled by slower command structures, was simply unable to adapt. They were fighting the last war, while Germany was fighting the next. This fundamental difference in approach sealed the campaign's outcome. Press reports glorified the technical skill and raw bravery of the German soldier, but rarely mentioned the intricate coordination that made it possible. Mistakes were omitted, missile record. Everything was presented as part of a perfect, calculated sequence. The narrative was clear. The new German army, rejuvenated and professional, was unconquerable. Across the cities of the Reich, the victory was met with parades, speeches, and a wave of national exaltation. It was a triumph built not only on the battlefield, but in the mind. A carefully constructed reality, as potent and as fragile as the empire it was meant to forge. The years of crisis harrowed the nation, a conviction that history itself was being rewritten, that the ghosts of the past had finally been exorcised. Within the German High Command, this triumph was distilled into a cold, concrete doctrine. The Blitzkrieg was no longer seen as a favorable exception, a perfect storm of circumstance, but as a repeatable formula for conquest. This intoxicating optimism would directly shape the planning of every subsequent operation. It was now an article of faith that any front, anywhere, could be shattered with the right application of pressure. This absolute confidence in tactical superiority became the decisive factor in the fateful choices to come, both in the East and beyond. The campaign in France did not merely expand the Reich's domain, it fundamentally transformed the perception of the conflict. For many within the regime, this was the ultimate confirmation. The destiny of Europe lay in German hands. Speed and will, it appeared, were all that was required to vanquish any enemy. The morale of the army surged. This swift, seemingly clean campaign stood in stark contrast to the haunting memories of the previous war, where every meter of ground was paid for with thousands of lives. Now, the divisions returned not as survivors, but as celebrated victors, their chests heavy with decorations. The sense that this new form of warfare could be waged without the grinding attrition of the past reinforced the entire structure of command, from the field marshals to the political leadership. This collective euphoria, built upon a lightning victory, solidified the myth of invincibility. Logistically, too, success was interpreted as proof that the German war machine could operate with flawless efficiency far beyond its own borders. Supplies, repairs, the ceaseless movement of troops, all had functioned without significant interruption. This bolstered the belief that the Reich could sustain prolonged operations, so long as it dictated the tempo of the offensive. The army, the populace, and the leadership were united in a single, unwavering vision. The model worked, the strategy was supreme, and the war was winnable. This internal consensus was amplified by a propaganda machine that left no space for doubt. Every signpost pointed toward continued expansion. Each step taken in 1940 seemed to prove that the fusion of political determination, technological might, and offensive doctrine was enough to conquer a continent. The reality of such a rapid victory, achieved against so little apparent resistance, emboldened the command and the people alike. At the close of that year, Germany stood at the absolute apex of its confidence. The myth of the Blitzkrieg, now fueled by undeniable fact, would define the course of the conflict. But across a narrow sea, the sky was closing in. For victory carries its own shadow, a dangerous belief that fortune is a servant, when it is, and always has been, a fickle and unforgiving master. In the summer of 1940, with the armies of France vanquished and the continent of Europe lying prostrate, Adolf Hitler's gaze fell across the narrow waters of the English Channel. The final obstacle to his dominion was the island of Great Britain. An order was issued, and a plan was given a name of predatory intent, Operation Sea Lion. It was to be the final act in a string of stunning victories. But this was a different theater of war, a new and complex challenge. An invasion of this scale could not be launched across open water. It required absolute mastery of the sea, and more critically, the sky. The German command understood a fundamental truth. No soldier could set foot on British soil until the Royal Air Force was neutralized, its wings broken. The task fell to the Luftwaffe, an air arm convinced of its own invincibility, its pilots seasoned by the swift campaigns in Poland and France. The offensive began in July, a prelude to the storm that would break in August. Day after day, hundreds of sorties crossed the Channel, a relentless wave of steel and fire. Their targets were the sinews of Britain's defense, the airfields from which its fighters rose, the radar stations that served as the island's eyes, and the lines of communication that bound them together. The goal was a systematic, surgical annihilation of Britain's capacity to fight. But the Germans were striking at a more formidable opponent than they had anticipated. Britain was not just an island, it was a fortress, defended by a revolutionary system of early warning radar. This technology gave Fighter Command precious, life-saving minutes to scramble its squadrons. British pilots fought with the singular advantage of proximity, operating close to their home bases, while German aircraft strained at the very edge of their range. Their time in combat measured in fleeting moments before fuel reserves dictated a return. The tactical doctrine that had shattered armies on the ground did not translate seamlessly to the fluid, three-dimensional warfare of the skies. The Luftwaffe's numerical superiority was blunted by a critical flaw in its design. Its bombers were sluggish and vulnerable. The fighter escorts tasked with their protection, the formidable Messerschmitt 109s, were hobbled by their limited endurance, often forced to abandon their charges long before the target was reached. This left the bomber formations exposed, prey for the Hurricanes and Spitfires that swarmed them, turning the blue skies of southern England into a graveyard of twisted metal. Despite staggering losses, the German offensive continued, adapting its strategy in a desperate attempt to find a weakness. For weeks, they pounded the radar installations, hoping to blind their enemy. Then, they focused their full might on the airfields, seeking to crater the runways and smash the RAF on the ground. Yet, the Royal Air Force endured. Seeing that its adversary refused to break, the Luftwaffe made a fateful pivot. In early September, the bombing raids were redirected. The new targets were not military, but civilian. The sprawling heart of the empire, London itself, was now in the crosshairs. This was no longer a purely military calculation. The intent was to sow terror, to shatter the morale of a people, and to force a capitulation through fear. It was a profound and catastrophic misjudgment. The fires that consumed homes and historic streets did not ignite panic and surrender. Instead, from the rubble and the ruin, an unbreakable resolve was forged. The very act designed to break the spirit of a nation had, in the end, become the crucible in which it was hardened into steel. On the ground, a different kind of war was being waged, a battle for the national soul. Propaganda, stark and resolute, fortified a collective spirit. Authorities moved with grim purpose, distributing gas masks that became a haunting feature of daily life. Shelters were dug, evacuation systems established, spiriting children away from the epicenters of the coming storm. Above, in the contested skies, British pilots clawed back against a foe that often held the advantage of numbers. But the defenders possessed an intimate knowledge of the terrain below, a web of familiar fields and coastlines. A ready network of support rose to meet them the moment they touched down. Across the Channel, within the German High Command, doubt began to fester. The promised clear and decisive results failed to materialize. An initial, arrogant confidence in a swift aerial victory began to erode with each passing week. The The figures told a brutal story. Aircraft losses were mounting at an unsustainable rate. Industrial production could not stanch the bleeding of attrition. More critically, the irreplaceable resource, experienced pilots, was becoming perilously scarce. In stark contrast, the Royal Air Force was regenerating. Its industrial system, fully adapted for war and bolstered by external aid, replaced aircraft with remarkable speed. The legendary fighters, the Spitfire and the Hurricane, proved devastatingly effective. Squadrons were meticulously rotated, a strategy designed to stave off the ravages of exhaustion. The situation for the invaders grew more tense as intelligence reports painted a picture not of collapse, but of resilience. Key British defense installations remained stubbornly operational. Airfields, cratered one day, were repaired and active the next. Aircraft production had not been halted. If anything, the assault seemed to harden British resolve. This unforeseen tenacity forced a profound reconsideration in Berlin. The grand design for a ground invasion, Operation Sea Lion, was not officially cancelled, but its execution was postponed indefinitely. The specter of invasion receded as the units assigned to it were quietly redeployed for other duties. Adolf Hitler, so certain of a favorable outcome, was forced to accept a bitter truth. The United Kingdom would not fall to a rapid air offensive. This failure sent ripples through the very fabric of German society. Propaganda had meticulously crafted a narrative of inevitable, unstoppable military advances. Each conquest was heralded as proof of national superiority. The offensive against Britain had been framed as the final step in consolidating a new European order. But as the objective remained stubbornly out of reach, the tone began to shift. Official communiques diverted attention from the campaign. The media ceased its confident predictions of Britain's imminent collapse, reframing the relentless bombing raids as mere punitive measures, part of a prolonged war of blockade. The change did not go unnoticed by a population conditioned to a narrative of constant victory. Internally, the German command scrambled for explanations. Some blamed the notoriously fickle weather. Others pointed to a fatal lack of coordination between the branches of the armed forces. And there was growing criticism of the strategy dictated by Hermann Göring, who had promised his Führer that the Luftwaffe alone could bring an empire to its knees. A war is fought not only with steel and fire, but with belief. And for the first time, in the skies over a defiant island, the belief in invincibility had been broken against the hard reality of human will. The conviction was absolute. Complete control of the air would be achieved, without the need for a single ship from the Navy. But the confidence vested in the pilots and their machines was not returned in the results. In the aftermath, fissures appeared in the monolithic facade of the military leadership. For all the experience gathered in the campaigns that had swept the continent, this was the first time the German war machine had failed to meet its objectives with brutal immediacy. The air war against the United Kingdom was a turning point. It did not halt the advance, but it revealed that the advance had limits. The failure in the British skies sent shockwaves through the very doctrines of aerial warfare. Commanders were forced to rethink the design of their bombers, now seeking machines with far greater range and more formidable defensive capabilities. The intricate systems of fighter escorts, the coordination between squadrons, the vast, unseen web of logistics, all were subjected to a harsh reevaluation. In parallel, alternative strategies for future campaigns began to take shape. The leadership now understood they could not depend on a single tactic, a single weapon. The Blitzkrieg had been devastating on the ground, but in the air, it required adaptations that had never been foreseen. The British experience delivered a stark lesson. An enemy with sound technical preparation and the unyielding will to resist could alter the very course of a war. On the German home front, a new and unsettling quiet took hold. Though the full truth of the results was obscured, it was clear that something had changed. The indefinite suspension of the ground invasion and a growing silence in the state-controlled media bred a creeping uncertainty. Propaganda worked to shore up morale, speaking of inevitable future victories or a coming diplomatic solution. But for the first time since the conflict began, doubts surfaced about the infallibility of the leadership. Voices, still in whispers, began to wonder if the United Kingdom would prove a far more complex obstacle than anyone had imagined. The initial, feverish enthusiasm was beginning to cool. In time, the strategic priorities of the Reich would shift, and efforts would be focused on other fronts. Even so, the air battle over England left a permanent mark. It was a brutal education in the limits of aviation, the vital importance of logistics, and the profound ability of an enemy to adapt and endure. Though the German command would attempt to frame the campaign as a partial success, in practice it was a strategic setback. The failure to defeat the Royal Air Force, the failure to pave the way for an invasion, prevented the Third Reich from consolidating its total dominion over Western Europe. Unlike an offensive on land, where conquered terrain offers the visible proof of victory, the war in the air was a battle of attrition fought in an invisible theater. It revealed a new kind of weakness, not in the machines of war, but in the assumption that a nation's will could be broken from the sky alone. In the skies over England, the war was a brutal calculus of coordination, timing, and the enemy's breaking point. The Luftwaffe would learn a bitter lesson, that numerical superiority and a legacy of victory were no guarantee. Here, a complex alchemy of technology, tactics, and human will would decide the future of a continent. Against the immense pressure, the British held their airspace. They preserved their capacity to fight, and in doing so, the most ambitious design of Adolf Hitler's war, the conquest of the United Kingdom, crumbled into impossibility. The air offensive was more than a strategic setback. It was the first time the German military machine had met an obstacle it could not crush. The consequences rippled through the high command, forcing a redesign of grand strategy, a reorientation of immense resources. A chilling realization began to dawn. This war would not be as swift, nor as one-sided, as they had imagined. The summer of 1940 had proven a vital theorem, that organized resistance, fused with adequate technology and unbreakable morale, could halt an enemy that had, until then, seemed invincible. The experience altered the very rhythm of the conflict, and though the Reich would continue its advance on other fronts, it would never again move with the same arrogant certainty of immediate victory. Even before the skies over Britain had cleared, the German command's next objective was already in focus. For months, Hitler had confided to his inner circle a long-held obsession, a great campaign in the East. In his mind, a confrontation with the Soviet Union was not a possibility. It was an inevitability, a necessary, brutal step to secure the Lebensraum, the living space that his ideology demanded. This was a vision steeped in a doctrine of racial hatred. The East, with its vast plains populated by Slavic peoples, deemed racially inferior, was to be subjugated, its resources plundered, its lands colonized. Soviet communism was not merely a rival ideology, it was an existential foe to be annihilated at its very roots. Systematic planning began in the wake of the British stalemate. While England remained an unresolved military problem, the gears were already turning for a new, far larger invasion. In December of 1940, Hitler signed Directive No. 21, codenamed Operation Barbarossa. The order was explicit. The Wehrmacht was to be prepared to launch its offensive by May 15, 1941. The instructions were chillingly clear. It was to be a war of annihilation, a swift campaign to dismantle the Red Army, a final, decisive stroke that promised to end it all. The design was for a war of annihilation, a single, devastating blow, delivered before the colossal Soviet machine could stir from its slumber. It was to be a campaign of lightning, swifter and more terrible than the victories in the West, but waged on a scale that would dwarf all that had come before. The logistics were staggering. 3 immense army groups, a tide of steel and men, prepared to surge across a front spanning nearly 3,000 kilometers. Army Group North, aimed at the cradle of the revolution, Leningrad. Army Group Center, the spearhead, pointed directly at the heart, Moscow. To the south, a third force would drive into the vast, fertile breadbasket of Ukraine. Flanked by Allied forces from Romania, Finland, and Hungary, the assembly was unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. It was, at that moment, the largest single military operation in human history. More than 3 million German soldiers, hundreds of thousands of horses, a ghost of a previous century's warfare, moved alongside thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and armored vehicles. A veil of secrecy, though imperfect, shrouded the final preparations. The sheer mass of men and material could not be entirely hidden. Yet on the other side of the border, an unnerving stillness prevailed, a faith perhaps placed in the fragile Pact of Non-Aggression, signed in 1939. Then, in the pre-dawn silence of June 22, 1941, the storm broke. Without a declaration of war, the border was erased. Simultaneously, the sky erupted. Heavy artillery tore into the earth, while the Luftwaffe descended upon sleeping Soviet airfields, command posts, and supply depots. In the first critical hours, hundreds of Soviet aircraft were turned to wreckage before their engines could turn over. The sky, in nearly every sector, now belonged to Germany. The panzers surged forward, a torrent of mechanized fury, with waves of infantry following in their wake to secure the ravaged land. The shock was absolute. The Red Army, caught unprepared, its leadership in disarray, seemed to simply dissolve. Entire divisions were encircled and annihilated before they could comprehend the attack. Communication lines were severed. Chaos cascaded down the chain of command, leaving formations isolated and rudderless. Within weeks, the advance had swallowed hundreds of kilometers of Soviet territory. The columns of prisoners stretched to the horizon. Cities and towns fell, one after another. To the north, the advance swept through the Baltic states, seizing Riga and closing on the gates of Leningrad. In the center, the jaws of a great pincer movement snapped shut around Minsk, and then again at Smolensk, creating vast pockets of destruction. Even in the south, against stiffer resistance, the Wehrmacht pushed deep into Ukraine, the spires of Kiev now within sight. From Berlin, the broadcasts were triumphant. Propaganda painted a masterpiece of absolute victory, another testament to the invincible might of the Wehrmacht. This was not an invasion, the narrative insisted, but a crusade, a righteous, preventative war to save civilization itself. Official bulletins recited the staggering numbers of captured men, charting the relentless speed of an advance that seemed unstoppable. The map was being redrawn daily, each pin a fallen city, each line a conquered territory. But maps can be deceptive. They cannot show the vastness of the steppe, the coming of the winter, or the resilience of a people pushed to the edge of existence. In the intoxicating rush of victory, an ancient truth was being forgotten, that the land itself has a memory, and it does not yield its soul so easily. The weakness of the enemy was a proclaimed truth, a certainty broadcast across the Reich. The total collapse of the Soviet Union, it was insisted, was a matter of mere weeks. In print and over the airwaves, maps blazed with the ink of new German territories. Communiques from the High Command spoke of a single, unbroken chain of victories. This narrative was received by a populace gripped by a mixture of elation, relief, and a deep sense of historical destiny. For many, the war in the East was no mere conflict. It was the final, decisive struggle. Yet within the inner sanctum of the High Command, the triumphant monolith showed hairline fractures. While optimism was the prevailing doctrine, some officers harbored a gnawing doubt. They questioned the logistical capacity to sustain such momentum across a boundless front. Difficulties with supply, the relentless wear on vehicles, the immense challenge of securing the ever-lengthening lines. These were the constant whispered anxieties. The velocity of the German advance was at once its supreme strength and its most perilous risk. Every kilometer gained was another kilometer that separated the fighting man from his source of supply. And the Soviet resistance, though shattered and chaotic in the opening onslaught, was beginning to coalesce. In isolated sectors, enemy troops were mounting a cohesive, desperate defense, bleeding the German spearheads of their precious momentum. Despite these omens, the numbers in those first months were intoxicating. The initial operations had yielded a staggering harvest. In the great pockets of Minsk, Smolensk, and Uman, more than 500,000 Soviet soldiers were swept from the field. Panzer divisions tore deep wounds in the enemy lines, enveloping entire armies. The German command held to a simple, powerful conviction. A few more decisive blows would shatter Moscow and decapitate the Soviet state. The entire strategy was staked on the premise of a short war, a framework where seizing military objectives took precedence over the grinding work of occupation. Week after week, the situation remained intoxicatingly favorable. The front bled ever eastward. German troops stood on the banks of the Dnieper and the Dvina, great natural barriers now overcome. Specialized engineering units worked feverishly, throwing bridges across rivers and mending railways to feed the advance. Cities fell, often found partially empty, the specter of the German war machine having preceded it. While the orders for occupation were steeped in ideological hostility, the military's gaze remained fixed on the horizon, on the next river, the next city. In Berlin, the triumphalist rhetoric was absolute. The Führer's public pronouncements echoed his unshakable belief that the campaign was in its final, glorious stretch. The theory that the Soviet Union was a colossus with feet of clay appeared to be a fact, proven in fire and steel on the endless plains of the East. A victory drawn on a map, however, is a fragile thing, an illusion of control over a vast and unforgiving reality that was only just beginning to awaken. The initial months were marked by a stunning lack of effective defense. A message echoed across the continent. Communism would be eradicated, and history itself was undergoing a fundamental transformation. The propaganda machine surged into motion, casting its soldiers as the architects of a new epic. Newsreels flickered with images of panzers crossing endless plains, of German flags unfurling over distant villages, of maps where the front line crept ever closer to Moscow. Within Germany, the sentiment was overwhelmingly one of confidence. A populace, conditioned by nearly 2 years of ceaseless victory, assumed this new campaign would be merely another demonstration of innate superiority. The official communiques fed this perception. Each bulletin was a litany of conquest, thousands more prisoners taken, cities captured, new advances secured. Posters portrayed the Red Army as a disorganized, archaic force, incapable of a coherent response. Even those who harbored private doubts about the war's duration dared not voice them. Social pressure, state censorship, and a powerful, collective yearning for victory fused the official narrative into an unbreakable whole. All the while, the armies pushed deeper into the vastness of the Soviet interior. The singular objective, to reach Moscow before the first snows of winter, remained the unyielding priority. The advance continued, and though new obstacles began to bleed through the veneer of progress, the conviction of a swift victory held firm in the high command. Decisions were forged in the crucible of a short campaign. Prolonged scenarios were never considered. A war of attrition was a failure of imagination. The Soviet state, they believed, would collapse under the shock, just as others had before. The message was absolute. Operation Barbarossa was presented as a logical, inevitable, and righteous crusade. It was a fight for Germany's very survival against an enemy defined as ideological, racial, and existential. In this telling, every step eastward was an affirmation of national destiny. But where the grand narrative ended, the earth began. From the moment they crossed the border, German soldiers confronted a reality alien to all previous campaigns. The space was immeasurable. The roads, mere suggestions dissolving into impassable mires. Nature itself showed no mercy. As they moved deeper, the daily existence on the Eastern Front became a hostile ritual. Fatigue was no longer measured in days, but in every agonizing meter of ground gained. The mud, clinging to their uniforms, never dry, were threadbare shrouds against the relentless damp and the slashing wind. But the mud and the cold were merely the prelude. Sleep was a fugitive luxury, stolen in open fields or the skeletal remains of farmhouses, haunted by the uncertainty of the dawn. Each day was a question, a skirmish, a bombardment, an improvised retreat, or simply more miles of a march to nowhere. Provisions, calculated with an optimism that had no place here, began to vanish. Field kitchens, mired in the same mud, could not keep pace. Hunger became a constant companion, a dull ache interrupted only by theft, barter, or a stroke of impossible luck. Letters sent home carried the weight of this decay, speaking in veiled phrases of exhausted bodies and days without a hot meal. The cold was an invasive force, penetrating every layer. Blankets were a futile defense. Fingers froze to the steel of a rifle. In the depths of winter, each breath was a painful, crystalline act, and the icy bell. In these extremes, fatigue ceased to be merely physical. It became a shroud over the mind, a fog that hampered judgment and slowed every movement. The anxiety of the front was a relentless thief of rest. With sleep shattered by the distant echo of gunfire, or by the simple, gnawing fear that kept the body coiled and tense. Even in moments of quiet, security was an illusion. The fear of an ambush, a mine, a sniper's single, unseen shot infested every silent step. The most agonizing moments, some would later write, were the quiet ones, the ones pregnant with the unknown. This unending tension wore down the most hardened veterans, men who confessed in their diaries that the Eastern Front was a different kind of war, a thing apart from all they had ever known. From a world away, official propaganda spun a tale of heroic conquest. German newsreels flickered with images of smiling soldiers and triumphant advances, of captured cities and a Soviet resistance on the verge of collapse. But those on the front lines saw only the truth. The captured cities were hollowed-out shells, offering neither shelter nor spoils. The land, emptied of its people, was a desolate theater of constant peril. Some carried pamphlets filled with motivational freakle story, and their lived reality grew wider with every sunrise. And yet, many refused to surrender to doubt. They clung to the familiar words of their orders, repeating the promise of an ultimate victory. It was not a belief born of evidence, but a fortress built in the mind, a last psychological refuge against a truth too vast and too terrible to comprehend. For the soldier on the Eastern Front, victory had ceased to be a strategic certainty. It was now a distant, flickering hope. A fragile lifeline remained, the arrival of mail. Letters from home were one of the few consolations in a world stripped of comfort. These messages, often brief and months old, were enough to momentarily suspend the crushing sense of abandonment. But even in these intimate exchanges, a new language was emerging. Soldiers began to filter their disenchantment through veiled phrases, a carefully constructed lexicon of despair designed to evade the censor's pen. They spoke of the difficult life here, of endless nights, or of a land without end. Others, pushed closer to the edge, were more explicit, confessing a gnawing fear, a deep frustration with the conditions, and utter incomprehension at the war's grindingly slow pace. The brotherhood of the front lines was itself a paradox. In the crucible of shared suffering, unbreakable bonds were forged. Yet, this same crucible could incinerate the spirit. Exhaustion frayed nerves, giving way to bitter arguments, friction, and a pervasive hopelessness. Not everyone endured equally. Some sought solace in the fleeting oblivion of alcohol when it could be found. Others retreated into a fortress of silence, their behavior growing erratic, the visible tremors of a mind pushed to its breaking point. While formal discipline held, the command was not blind. They saw the symptoms of an army that, though still operational, was beginning to show deep fractures of profound wear. The vast geographical distance bred its own kind of chaos. Orders from high command arrived late, were often contradictory, and seemed based on inaccurate maps or dangerously outdated assumptions. The reality on the ground was a brutal refutation of the reports flowing back to Berlin. The enemy, which was to have collapsed within weeks, fought on with savage tenacity. Soviet units, shattered and routed, would somehow reorganize, counterattack, and reclaim blood-soaked ground. Each new attempt to advance demanded more resources, more energy, and always more lives. The intoxicating euphoria that had marked the start of the operation had completely vanished. In its place was a bone-deep exhaustion. The feeling of invincibility was no longer a topic of conversation. It was a hollow echo from a forgotten summer. A resigned acceptance took root, an understanding of the savage nature of this war, where routine was built not on the expectation of success, but on the simple, brutal act of endurance. In this void of certainty, men took refuge in the personal, the irrational. They clutched at rituals and superstitions, small acts of faith against an indifferent universe. Fingers were crossed before a patrol. Photographs were hidden in pockets, talismans to feel less alone, to retain some sliver of control amid the maelstrom. An emotional chasm was also widening between the front and the rear guard. The things they had seen, the things they had done, were impossible to explain, perhaps even to accept themselves. A quiet conviction grew among the men. No one, save the comrade shivering beside them, could ever understand. This isolation deepened with each passing week. Expectations of a quick return had long since dissolved. No one spoke of dates anymore. The future was now a conditional clause. We get through this. The question was no longer when they would go home. but if. In the vast emptiness of the East, time itself began to fray. Days bled into one another, a featureless expanse marked only by the turning of the seasons, and sometimes, not even by that. The clocks, it seemed, had frozen. Hidden within the folds of a uniform, tucked deep inside a rucksack, personal diaries became the last bastion of the individual. In their pages, in brief, frantic script or long, meandering prose, a more intimate and brutal truth took shape. They spoke of the terror of sleep, of wounded comrades whose cries could not be answered, of marches that stretched beyond 12 hours without rest. Amid the exhaustion, reflections surfaced. Doubts. Long silences broken by a whispered confession. This is not what we imagined. Few dared to speak it aloud. The weight of discipline, the ceaseless drone of propaganda, the iron grip of ideology held their tongues. Yet the chasm between the glorious front projected in Berlin and the hellish reality they endured grew wider with every sunrise. This was an experience unlike any in the Wehrmacht's history, an environment that systematically eroded a man's will, testing the very limits of physical and psychological endurance. In that immense and hostile landscape, the enemy was not only the opposing army, but the climate, the mud, the disease, and the crushing loneliness. They kept moving forward, for there was no other choice. But as the front ground men into dust, a different kind of war was being waged in the shadows of the homeland. From the earliest years of the regime, isolated individuals and quiet circles had harbored a dangerous dissent. Some resisted silently, a subtle refusal to display loyalty. Others dared to voice opposition in the trusted company of a few. As the war machine churned on, these scattered gestures began to coalesce. Within the universities, small groups of students and intellectuals met to analyze the nation's catastrophic course. The most renowned was the White Rose, formed around a core of Munich students, including the brother and sister Hans and Sophie Scholl. They chose words as their weapons. In secretly printed pamphlets, they exposed the atrocities being committed on the Eastern Front, appealing not to revolution, but to the moral conscience of the German people. It was a call for an ethical awakening. The state's response was immediate and absolute. They were arrested, interrogated, and condemned to death in summary trials. At the same time, on the streets, a different rebellion was stirring. Young people with no university affiliation, known as the Edelweiss Pirates, expressed their own discontent. Theirs was not a resistance of pamphlets and philosophy, but of defiant gestures and street-level opposition. From the frozen trenches to the clandestine printing presses, these were disparate acts of courage, born of the same unbearable truth. They were flickers of humanity in an age of darkness, a testament that even when a nation is consumed by a monstrous idea, the individual conscience can and must find a way to speak. In the shadows of the Reich, where conformity was law, a quiet rebellion stirred. Youthful cliques, rejecting the lockstep discipline of the party, began to carve out their own spaces of freedom. They met in secret, sharing the forbidden rhythms of banned songs, their sabotage a small but potent disruption to the carefully orchestrated theater of the Hitler Youth. They possessed no formal structure, no grand design to overthrow the state, yet their very existence was an intolerable affront to the regime's demand for total uniformity. For this crime of spirit, some were arrested, others were executed without the pretense of a trial. Even the houses of God became contested ground. Across both Catholic and Protestant faiths, a struggle ensued to preserve a sliver of doctrinal independence. Here and there, courageous voices rose above the silence. They spoke out against the state-sanctioned murder of the disabled, against the relentless persecution of a people. From his pulpit, the Catholic bishop Clemens von Galen delivered sermons that openly condemned the euthanasia program. The regime did not dare arrest a man of his stature, but its vengeance fell upon his collaborators, and the ever-watchful eyes of the Gestapo never left him. But the most dangerous cracks in the monolith appeared from within. Among the military ranks, men sworn to serve the nation began to question the path it was on. Officers, disillusioned by the ruinous course of the war, haunted by the crimes they had witnessed in the occupied territories, started to conspire in hushed tones. These whispers of conspiracy would finally coalesce into the most audacious attempt to decapitate the regime, the plot of July 20th, 1944. Led by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, the plan was a desperate gamble: to plant a bomb in the Führer's headquarters, eliminate the Nazi leadership, and forge a new government to sue for peace. The operation was meticulously planned, drawing in a network of high-ranking military men. The device exploded, but fate intervened. Hitler survived, shielded by a heavy oak table, suffering only minor injuries. The coup unraveled in a matter of hours. The regime's response was not merely a reaction, it was an eruption of pure fury. Mass arrests swept through the country. A brutal purge was unleashed upon the army and the civil administration. More than 5,000 people were seized, many with no connection to the plot whatsoever. The executions that followed were a study in calculated cruelty. Some were hanged slowly with piano wire, others beheaded. Their trials were mere formalities, staged performances of justice filmed and broadcast as a chilling instrument of intimidation. The terror did not stop with the accused. It radiated outward, consuming their relatives, their friends, their collaborators, real or imagined. Under the principle of collective responsibility, if one person was deemed a traitor, their entire circle could be punished. The logic was simple and absolute: to cauterize any possible future outbreak of dissent. The message was carved into the national psyche. There would be no tolerance, no mercy, for even the slightest gesture of opposition. For those living under the weight of such a system, the perception of these acts became a fractured and dangerous thing, a silent testament to how, in a world devoid of moral clarity, the line between traitor and hero is often drawn not by conscience, but by survival itself. In the aftermath, a carefully crafted narrative blanketed the Reich. Through the powerful machinery of propaganda and absolute censorship, the official version took hold. The conspirators were not men of conscience, but cowards and traitors. From public squares to the national airwaves, speeches thundered, extolling absolute loyalty to the Führer and demanding exemplary punishment. And for a vast portion of the population, this became the only truth. Yet, in the quiet corners of a nation bleeding from the consequences of war, doubts began to fester. For some, these acts were an expression of pure desperation. For others, they were the undeniable proof that not everyone shared the ruinous direction the country had taken. The regime's propaganda reacted, adapting its message with brutal efficiency. It reinforced the image of a unified nation, unwavering in its loyalty, portraying Hitler as the stoic victim of a treacherous plot. Simultaneously, it intensified its rhetoric against internal enemies, branding any opponent a saboteur, a spy. Posters appeared overnight on city walls. Public events were organized. Campaigns were launched to denounce any suspicious behavior. Surveillance became omnipresent, an unspoken duty of every citizen. The experience of the attack sent shockwaves through the inner circle. Hitler, deeply affected, grew increasingly distrustful. He distanced himself further from his advisors, reorganized his entire security detail, and ordered new protocols to prevent any similar attempt. His relationship with the Wehrmacht, the traditional German army, became irrevocably strained. In the vacuum, the power of the SS swelled, and the bodies of state oversight multiplied, strangling what little autonomy remained. The memory of those who dared to resist, from the student with a leaflet to the soldier who risked his life in an impossible conspiracy, remained fragmented throughout the conflict. Some were immediately forgotten, others were portrayed as traitors for years. Only much later, after the final collapse of the regime, did they begin to be recognized as symbols of a conscience that, although a minority, was not completely extinguished. Internal dissent in Nazi Germany failed to alter the course of the war, but it revealed that even under one of the most repressive regimes in history, there were voices willing to question, challenge, and resist. Amidst fear, absolute control, and omnipresent propaganda, there were those who chose another path, even though they knew their decision would almost certainly lead to their death. While this war against the internal enemy raged, the war on the frontiers was entering a new, desperate phase. As the conflict escalated and the possibility of a successful Blitzkrieg disappeared, the Third Reich was forced to completely transform its economic structure. The sheer scope of the war made the systematic mobilization of all resources unavoidable. During the early years, the regime had maintained an ambiguous policy, avoiding deep interference in the civilian economy. But with the failure to quickly crush the Soviet Union, that time was over. Total war now demanded a total economy, and the soul of the nation would be fed into its furnace. The war of lightning speed had stalled, its momentum broken against the vastness of the Soviet Union. With the entry of the United States into the conflict in 1941, the very nature of the struggle was transformed. A drastic, all-consuming shift was now demanded. This transformation would culminate in the doctrine of total war, a policy deployed with chilling vigor from 1943 onward. The entire German productive apparatus was to be subordinated, completely and without exception, to the needs of the state at war. The architect of this reorganization was Albert Speer, appointed Minister of Armaments after the death of his predecessor, Fritz Todt. Speer was not a traditionally trained engineer. His power stemmed from other sources: an intimate closeness to Hitler, a formidable administrative mind, and a relentless drive to centralize decisions. He would become the very face of the regime's technical efficiency. Under his leadership, profound reforms swept through the Reich's industrial landscape. Private industries were no longer partners, but instruments, working in lockstep with the state. The hierarchies of business were remade, adapted to the brutal logic of military production. Technical commissions were established to optimize the use of every last ounce of raw material, to eliminate the wasteful duplication in weapons design. Speer forged a network of regional armaments offices, overseen by his own hand-picked representatives, allowing for decisions to be made with a speed that bypassed the sclerotic, traditional bureaucracy. Soon, the numbers began to tell a story of impossible output. Even as Allied bombs rained down, the production of tanks, aircraft, and munitions climbed ever upward. By 1943, propaganda was hailing the Speer miracle, a potent symbol of Germany's capacity to resist, to respond, to endure. But this miracle was built on a hidden foundation. The staggering increase in production could not be sustained by German labor alone. Total war demanded an inexhaustible supply of human resources, and so the system turned to a vast, captive workforce. It began to resort to the massive, systematic use of forced laborers, drawn by the millions from the occupied territory. They were prisoners of war, captured in campaigns long past. They were civilians, swept up in raids across Poland, Ukraine, France, and beyond. They were deportees, transported in the most precarious conditions imaginable, and housed in guarded barracks huddled in the shadows of the industrial complexes. Here, subjected to grueling workdays, their lives were governed by a stark and brutal reality. The difference in treatment compared to German workers was a chasm. Punishments were frequent. Control was exercised with absolute ruthlessness. Survival depended not merely on performance, but on the arbitrary conduct of their supervisors. The regime justified their presence as a patriotic necessity, a dark truth deliberately concealed behind the veneer of wartime sacrifice. Within Germany itself, the population was progressively absorbed by the same unforgiving logic. As the recruitment of men for the front lines left gaping holes in the workforce, those gaps were filled by the mass entry of women into the world of industry. The machinery of war, perfected to an astonishing degree, had become inseparable from the machinery of oppression. One could not function without the other. In its relentless pursuit of efficiency, the state had engineered a system where the creation of weapons was measured not only in steel and labor, but in the calculated expenditure of human souls. For years, official doctrine had enshrined a woman's place in the home. But by 1943, the relentless pressure of a failing war forced a radical reversal. Ideology buckled under the weight of necessity. Suddenly, public campaigns blossomed, urging women to join the arsenal of the Reich. Technical courses were hastily offered. The very architecture of industry was remade to accommodate a new workforce, with schedules designed to coexist with domestic life. Production units installed cafeterias and daycare centers, concessions made not from compassion, but from cold calculation. This great mobilization was presented as a sacred, joint effort for victory. Glossy magazine pages placed women in work uniforms against the stark silhouettes of tanks and aircraft. And while conservative sectors bristled at these changes, the machinery of the state would brook no opposition to the war effort. Control over civilian life became absolute. The fate of every citizen was no longer their own, but a line item in a ledger decided in the Reich headquarters. Jobs were assigned according to strategic production criteria. Labor mobility was frozen to prevent regional imbalances. With unions long since dismantled, there was no voice for negotiation, no space for protest. It was the state that dictated the working day, that distributed the rations, that authorized leave. The factories, humming day and night under a relentless system of rotating shifts, were justified as the beating heart of a common goal. This entire apparatus was powered by propaganda. The airwaves carried breathless reports on production progress. Newspapers celebrated manufacturing figures as if they were battlefield victories. A new myth was forged, the national community in arms, where the worker was a combatant on the home front. In this supercharged atmosphere, any deviation, any hesitation, was immediately condemned as sabotage or treason. The transformation was total. Cities became canvases for sacrifice, their walls plastered with posters demanding more. Offices were reorganized to serve strategic needs. Children were not spared. They were instructed in the stark principles of productive discipline. Schools disseminated tales of technical achievement, and young people were dispatched to factories and farms as a core part of their patriotic training. This was not merely an economy in service of a war. It was an entire culture of work, redesigned and subjugated by the state. Official rhetoric declared this model superior to the chaotic, dispersed systems of the liberal West. It was proof, they argued, that iron discipline could transform even the darkest of times into an era of growth and order. And at the heart of this vast, intricate machine stood its symbol, Albert Speer. In his public appearances, he was the picture of calm capability, surrounded by blueprints, graphs, and the workers who fueled his plans. He eschewed the military uniform and the ideological tirades, cultivating the image of a master technician in the service of the Führer. Hitler himself would cite him as the embodiment of this new order. It was a chilling proposition that a society could be perfected, its every component functioning in lockstep. The German model, in its ultimate expression, demonstrated not the triumph of order, but the terrifying efficiency with which a nation could orchestrate its own destruction, all while celebrating the discipline that bound it to its fate. A new generation of German leader was ascendant, a model of the technical minister, capable of fusing ruthless efficiency with unwavering loyalty. Unburdened by the conventions of traditional bureaucracy, they reinforced the image of a dynamic government, perfectly adapted to the escalating demands of the conflict. But as the war ground on, those demands became absolute. Rationing systems tightened their grip. Movement within the nation's borders was strictly regulated. Private celebrations, the small joys of life, were curtailed. The culture of leisure was systematically dismantled and replaced by a culture of sacrifice. Theaters that staged frivolous shows went dark. Cinema was conscripted, its sole purpose now to exalt national resilience. The airwaves fell silent of light music, replaced by the percussive beat of patriotic marches and the somber drone of choirs. Even the churches were called upon to serve, their messages reframed to preach unity and commitment to the collective effort. The system left no gaps. Every sphere of human existence was bent to a single objective: to sustain the war at any cost. Through the intensive use of forced labor and the total mobilization of every internal resource, the German economy maintained a defiant hum of production, even as the tide of war turned against it. This grim paradox became a cornerstone of propaganda, proof that the nation remained unbowed. Suffering was no longer a consequence of failure, but an act of heroism. The promise of quick victory evaporated, replaced by the stark ideal of resistance. Territorial conquests mattered less than production figures. The Reich was reimagined, not as an expanding empire, but as a great, cohesive machine. As arms production reached record levels, it was enough to affirm that the cause was still alive. The narrative had changed, but the control only intensified. Every German, whether on the factory floor or in the home, was to assume their role without question, without hesitation. Total war was transforming the Reich, not merely its economy, but its very soul. And then, Stalingrad. The defeat, confirmed in January of 1943, was a chasm dividing the war into a before and an after. It was more than a catastrophic military loss, more than the annihilation of the Sixth Army. It was a profound emotional collapse, a shockwave that rippled through the army and the homeland alike. The weeks that followed were shrouded in an unnatural silence. Official discourse faltered. War reports no longer spoke of glorious advances. The word Stalingrad was a specter, slow to be uttered by high-ranking officials. The retreat that began on the frozen steppe was not only territorial, it was psychological, seeping into every level of the state, into a civilian population that, for the first time, began to gaze into the future with a terrifying mixture of fear and resignation. Within the army, the change was absolute. An unshakable trust in Germany's ability to overcome any obstacle had been the bedrock of its officer corps. With the surrender of the Sixth Army, that confidence was not merely shaken, it was shattered. The great, cohesive machine had begun to devour itself, leaving behind not a heroic legacy, but the cold ash of a terrible certainty. The architecture of command began to fracture. Deep within the German war machine, internal reports betrayed a creeping disorientation. A chilling awareness set in, of an enemy now reacting with speed and ferocity, of unbearable pressure mounting on other fronts, of the stark futility of maintaining the initiative. In hushed transmissions between commanders, a dangerous new sentiment took root: doubt. For the first time, decisions from the highest echelons, once accepted as gospel, were being questioned. What had been conceived as a complex but manageable campaign devolved into a desperate chain of defensive maneuvers, each one yielding less control than the last. In the rear, the truth became undeniable. Evacuation orders were issued for occupied territories. Battered units were hastily restructured. Reinforcements, once a torrent, slowed to a trickle. The narrative of victory was collapsing in on itself. Images once unimaginable became commonplace. German columns, mired in mud, trudging westward, their skies empty of air cover. The soldier was no longer the conqueror. He was a survivor, fighting simply to remain on his feet. As casualties soared, the weight fell upon mid-level officers, forced to confront situations for which no training could have prepared them. The German initiative had vanished. The adversary now dictated the rhythm of the war. At the very center of power, the shockwave of Stalingrad was devastating. The absolute, unshakable confidence projected by Adolf Hitler began to erode. In public, the rhetoric of unwavering will remained. But in private, he grew more irritable, more suspicious, less receptive to any opinion but his own. The command structure became a rigid echo chamber. Suggestions were dismissed, catastrophic losses were minimized, and Germany's own capabilities were grotesquely exaggerated. Generals watched as the heart of decision-making ceased to respond to realistic assessments, operating instead on a distorted, self-serving vision of reality. Meetings grew tense. To mention a critical fact was to risk ruin. The propaganda apparatus spun furiously, attempting to weave a tapestry of heroic sacrifice, of a defense to the last man, of unyielding loyalty to the Führer. But the threads were unraveling. Accounts from captured soldiers and news filtering in through uncontrolled channels made the official story impossible to sustain. Across the Reich, dials turned to foreign shortwave stations. Families who had heard nothing from their sons at the front began to surrender to their darkest fears. Rumors of what had truly happened in the frozen city grew uncontrollably, and the state's pronouncements were met with quiet disbelief. In the factories and neighborhoods, a single name became a whisper, a symbol of catastrophe. For the first time, an entire people began to sense that the path they were on did not lead to glory, but to an abyss. A myth had been broken, and in its place, a terrible silence began to grow. It began not as a declaration, but as a shadow in the mind. The word, defeat. Once banished from the lexicon, it now seeped into the consciousness of the German people. A profound shift was underway. Where victory speeches had once been met with roaring enthusiasm, they were now greeted by a wall of quiet skepticism. The symptoms of a society fraying at the edges were becoming undeniable. Lines for provisions grew longer, the mail from the front grew sporadic, and with every delay, a palpable anxiety tightened its grip. Conversations changed their tenor. In public, some still recited the official pronouncements, but in private spaces, voices lowered, daring to speak of an unfavorable end. Censorship remained absolute, but it could not police the human heart. In the quiet corners of the Reich, the heresy was spreading. The war could be lost. Some clung to the desperate hope of a sudden, miraculous turn of fortune. Others, more clear-eyed, began the grim task of preparing their minds for what now seemed inevitable. From this soil of disillusionment, a passive resistance began to emerge. It was not an organized movement with leaders or manifestos. It was something more elemental, a collection of individual reactions, a weariness in the factory, a disinterest in state-sponsored campaigns, a careful sidestepping of public debate. Peer pressure still held its power, but more and more were searching for ways to vent their discontent without inviting direct reprisal. The retreat on the battlefield was mirrored by a collapse of faith in the leadership. A perception took hold that decisions were no longer guided by rational strategy, but by the blind obstinance of a command disconnected from reality. The state's desperate attempts to manufacture morale, with speeches, awards, and hollow parades, grew increasingly ineffective. Even party officials admitted privately that the initial, fervent spirit had vanished. The question hanging in the air was no longer how to win, but how to endure. From the officers at the front to the workers in the rear, the immense energy of the early years had curdled into a toxic mixture of exhaustion, resignation, and fear. And then, the war came home from the sky. As the tide turned sharply against Germany, its cities began to feel the full, brutal weight of Allied air power. From 1943 onward, the raids became a relentless, devastating drumbeat. Night, once a reprieve, became a recurring nightmare of wailing sirens and trembling earth. Entire families huddled in shelters as explosions tore their world apart. Each dawn revealed a new, unrecognizable landscape of ash and rubble. A silent transformation was complete. There was no grand open rupture, no mass uprising. There was, instead, a profound change in the very texture of daily life. Obedience became mechanical, expressions of enthusiasm forced, the following of orders automatic. A nation was still performing its duties, but the conviction that had once fueled it had long since burned away. All that remained was the hollow shell, awaiting the final, shattering blow. Where buildings had once stood, only smoking ruins remained. Businesses were ground to rubble, homes erased into craters. The human cost was measured in the thousands. The arteries of civilization had been severed, water and electricity vanished, food grew scarce, and fear became a constant, suffocating companion. This was no longer a matter of material destruction. It was a mortal wound to the spirit of a people who were slowly awakening to a terrifying truth. Defeat was not merely possible, but inevitable, and drawing closer with every sunrise. The regime, in its death throes, resorted to frantic, final gambits. It summoned the Volkssturm, a people's storm, a ghost army of men too old or boys too young for the regular service. They were given hasty training, armed with relics from another era, and sent on impossible missions against an enemy advancing with tidal certainty. The streets became a haunting tableau, adolescents swallowed by uniforms meant for men, the elderly clutching sharpened canes as weapons of last resort, women, their roles violently redefined from guardians of the home to wardens of civil defense. Schools fell silent, their halls repurposed as logistical hubs for a war already lost. City squares became desperate distribution points for the last of the arms, the last of the food. The state's machinery of lies churned on, promising a final victory that no one believed. The official language spoke of glorious counteroffensives, yet the only reality was a relentless succession of retreat, destruction, and death. To the east, a new dread gathered momentum. Whispers of the advancing Red Army carried stories of razed villages, brutal reprisals, and a vengeance as boundless as the steppes from which it came. Soon, in the capital itself, the whispers became a roar. The deep percussion of Soviet artillery was a constant, visceral reminder of the approaching end, as relentless as a heartbeat counting down to zero. The city, for years a symbol of defiant power, was now a besieged fortress with no escape. Streets were scarred with makeshift trenches. Buildings stood as half-ruined bastions. The shelters beneath the earth, once a promise of safety, became shared graves. Survival was a moment-to-moment calculus of terror, a choice between fearing the shells from above, the crossfire in the streets, or the summary judgment of their own commanders, who ruthlessly executed any deemed a coward or a saboteur. The end did not arrive with a thunderous proclamation or a grand ceremony. It came as a final decision, made in the suffocating confines of a subterranean bunker while the world above disintegrated. The news seeped through the chaos, unconfirmed and without detail. It was met not with shock, nor with surprise, but with a profound and absolute silence. For many, it was simply the quiet realization that everything was over. There were no coherent commands, no plans, no possible direction. All that remained was the hollow echo of what had been, and the vast, silent emptiness of the inevitable. In the stillness that followed the final gunshot, the last pockets of resistance crumbled. Weapons were laid down in silence, not in ceremony. The war for Germany was over. What remained was not a country, but a ghost, a vast, sprawling necropolis where cities had become monuments to annihilation, their skeletal remains clawing at a sky thick with smoke. The very wires of the nation had been severed. Communication was a memory. Factories, the once thundering hearts of industry, were now silent tombs of iron. Through this purgator drifted through the wreckage. They searched not for victory or vengeance, but for a crust of bread, a sip of clean water, or the impossible grace of a familiar face. The infrastructure of life itself had been erased. Hospitals, overwhelmed by the tide of the wounded, could offer little more than a place to die. Schools stood hollow. Transport was a fantasy. There was only the profound silence of the streets, broken by the wind whistling through shattered buildings, and the bodies of the forgotten, left where they had fallen. The state, the very idea of authority, had dissolved into the ash. There were no laws, no services, no future to plan for, only the present, sharp and brutal. In the absence of society, all that was left was the primal, desperate instinct for one more day, one more breath. There was no time to reflect on what was lost, for survival demanded every waking thought. In the ruins of a fallen empire, humanity was reduced to its most essential and agonizing truth: the simple, unrelenting will to endure.